You have enemies now. Rich ones. You can take off those things. We know what they hide. We know who you are.
Before we get into the actual shots, I want to pause for a moment and go one layer deeper. Because while we're going to be looking at specific scenes from Blue-Eyed Samurai, what I really want to talk about here is the how. How do you design a fight scene if you haven't really designed one before? And even more importantly, how do you design one in a week? When you're hired onto a project, you don't get unlimited time to figure things out. You're paid by the week. You're expected to produce. And that means you need a way to move from uncertainty to something actionable, fast. So what I want to offer you in this episode isn't answers. It's stones to step on. A simple framework, places to stand, so you can orient yourself, trust your instincts, and move forward with confidence. Every part of this process is guided by a single question. What do I need to know before I can responsibly draw the next thing? Before we draw a single shot, we move through a pre-drawing phase. This is part of the process most artists can feel, but they rarely name. To navigate that space, I will work through 5 modules. Module 1, Calibration. Module 2, Emotional beats. Module 3, Locations. Where are we? Module 4, 3D assists. Module 5, the setup with your layer comps. Each module exists for a reason. Each one helps me orient myself before committing to the marks on the page. Module 1, Calibration. Before I draw a single shot, the first thing I do is calibrate. Calibration isn't about copying, it's about absorbing energy. I am taking in different sources and letting them filter through me. I'm using them as a primer, so my body and my hand have something to release once I start drawing. Every project begins this way. It's what gives me direction before execution, especially when time is already a factor. I treat calibration like charging a battery. I don't need to know the solution yet. I just need enough energy and orientation to begin responsibly. This is where I build an internal compass: weight, rhythm, danger, and restraint. Once that compass is set, drawing stops feeling intimidating and starts feeling buildable. Rurouni Kenshin, movement and intent. One of the first sources I looked at was Rurouni Kenshin. When I was thinking about Mizu, I wanted to understand how she would engage against multiple attackers, not in terms of choreography, but in terms of movement and quality. Kenshin often enters a space with a kind of restrained fury. There's speed, but there's also control. I was watching how his weight shifts when violence releases and when it's held back. I wasn't studying the sword technique, I was calibrating the energy and how intent moves through the body. Akira Kurosawa, composition and staging. Another major calibration source was Akira Kurosawa. Here, I wasn't looking at action, I was looking at composition. Kurosawa is incredibly deliberate about how figures are staged after an action beat, where the characters land, how the frame resets, how space is used to prepare the next moment. This became especially important on the cliffside. Once you introduce height, edges, and exposure, composition isn't just visual, it becomes structural. I was absorbing how clarity is maintained even as tension escalates. Samurai Champloo, rhythm and personality. From there, I looked at Samurai Champloo, where what I was calibrating here was rhythm. The timing is loose, the energy is high, and personality comes through directly in the movement. Even in chaotic moments, the characters are still highly skilled, which gives their motion confidence instead of noise. That balance between expression and control become an important ingredient for this fight. Ninja Scroll, angularity and inconsequence. The last calibration source was Ninja Scroll. This pushed me toward angularity and consequence. The characters are sharp, the violence is brutal, and the compositions stay bold under extreme motion. What stood out to me was how readable everything remains, even when the action turns intense. That clarity, paired with brutality, became another color on the palette. So, the unifying principle. I treat all of this like a paint palette. I'm not copying any one source. I'm dipping into different energies, movement, composition, rhythm, and restraint, and then marrying that with what the script is asking for. That's how the results stay original. The references disappear, and what's left is the scene. Module 2. Emotional Beats. So, I want to do this in two parts. Part 1, script, story beats, the foundation. Before we can design action, we need something concrete to stand on. So for the first thing I do is take the script, the specific scene I'm responsible for, and break it down into actionable story beats. At this stage, I'm not adding anything. I'm not interpreting. I'm just taking what's already there and breaking it down into clear, readable chunks. One character does this, another character reacts, something changes. These are moments, moment to moment to moment, and together they form a sequence. A single storyboard frame might represent one beat, or it might take several frames to fully articulate it visually. But once the script is broken down into beats, something very important happens. I can see the shape of the scene before I draw it. I can estimate how many boards I'll need. I can see where the density is. This becomes a practical map, not just creatively, but production-wise. Think of this as an overhead view, but in words. Before we choreograph movement, before we design shots, we're going to give ourselves a clear structural layout of what actually needs to happen. So, part 2. Once the story beats are clear, we move on to the next layer, emotional beats. Now we see a different question. What is happening emotionally inside these moments? If the 5 things are closing in on Mizu, is she calm, restrained, agitated? Are they aggressive, cautious? Are they testing her? I start adding descriptive adjectives to each beat, not to overthink it, but to give the drawing phase something to respond to. These emotional beats directly influence how things get drawn. They affect posture, timing, weight, distance. This is information the hand needs. Over time, this becomes one of those key differences between a solid storyboard artist and a much stronger one. You're no longer just illustrating action, you're shaping intent. Emotional beats let you see where things need to speed up and where they need to slow down. They give you control over rhythm before choreography even begins. So, emotional beats as a closing thought. So before I design movement, before I think of choreography, I give myself an overhead map using words. Once that map exists, drawing stops being guesswork and starts being a response. Module 3, Locations. Next, we're going to move on to Module 3, Location, the where. Once the story beats and emotional beats are clear, the next step is one we can't skip, location. We need to know where everything lives. This is where we move into spatial planning. Because action doesn't happen in a vacuum, it happens inside a space. At this stage, I'm not designing shots yet. I'm designing the container those shots will live in. The first thing I do is name the elements of the environment. Within this particular task, it is rocks, edges, drop-offs, paths, obstacles, and opportunities. I usually build a reference pool for this. Photographic reference, film stills, anything relevant, and keep it all in one folder on my hard drive. It doesn't need to be precious or overly organized, it just needs to be accessible. Spatial views. To understand the space clearly, I always draw it from multiple angles. First, I draw the location from above. This overhead view lets me map out distances, paths of movement, where characters can and cannot go, and how the environment constrains or supports action. Then, I'll add a side view or a three-quarter view. The side view is like cutting a cake right down the middle. It shows height, layers, vertical relationships. The three-quarter view gives just enough depth information to understand volume and scale. These drawings should be simple, basic shapes, light perspective, enough information to orient you, not to impress anyone. Why this matters? The goal here is not to polish, the goal here is to be clear. Once this work is done, you don't have to keep resolving space while you're storyboarding. You've already done the thinking. You can glance at these diagrams and immediately know where the characters are, how far they need to travel, what options they have, and what the environment allows or denies. This can even be viewed as an extended form of calibration. And once the space is understood, storyboarding becomes faster, clearer, and more intentional. Module 4, 3D Assists. The next module is 3D Assists. And I want to be very clear about what that means and what it doesn't. When I say 3D Assists, I'm not talking about replacing drawing. I'm talking about supporting judgment. On Blue-Eyed Samurai, my relationship to 3D was very different than it is now. At that time, I had operational knowledge. I could move through a 3D scene. I could navigate a model if it was provided, but I couldn't build environments or drive cameras in a meaningful way. And even that level of access was a luxury. Not every sequence had 3D models. Sometimes they existed, sometimes they did not. What I want to stress here is this: 3D is only useful if you already understand space. So, foundation first. You still need to know how to draw environments. You need a working understanding of perspective. 1 point through 5 point is more than enough. You need to be able to move from a blank page to a believable three-dimensional space without help. Because if you don't understand perspective, 3D won't save you, it will just confuse you. Why 3D helps? When used correctly, 3D does one very important thing. It frees up mental RAM. When I say mental RAM, I mean attention. You only have so much of it in a workday, and once it's depleted, decision-making gets sloppy. Tools like 3D don't replace thinking, they protect your attention so you can spend it on what matters. Deeper aspects of filmmaking and storytelling. The longer you can concentrate, the more intense the problem. The more the reserve gets chipped away. Phone calls, interruptions, context switching, even well-intentioned conversations, they all consume mental RAM. So, you're no longer burning energy resolving perspective over and over. That mental space can now be spent on staging, camera choice, rhythm, and storytelling. In other words, 3D lets you stop fighting geometry and start thinking like a filmmaker. So for this project, for this breakdown, I built a 3D model of the cliff environment. This model didn't exist during production. It is something I created afterwards so I could share the process to you more clearly. What I am using it for isn't polish, it's validation. I can move through the space, check drop-off points, test distances, see how verticality affects movement. Because once your overhead maps and drawings are done, 3D becomes a way to ask, what else is possible here? Used this way, 3D doesn't replace thinking, it confirms it. And that's the role it plays in this framework. Not authority, not automation, but support. Module 5, the setup, with your layer comps. Module 5, layer comps, efficiency and continuity. Before we draw anything, I want to set up something that makes the entire process more efficient. Photoshop is what I used when I boarded Blue-Eyed Samurai. Layer comps are specific to Photoshop. You won't find them in any other programs. But once you understand how they work, they completely change how efficiently you can storyboard within this software environment. Layer comps let you move through frames instantly, almost like an animatic, without turning layers on and off. It's one of the fastest ways to check flow, continuity, and cause and effect. So before we design the scene, let's set this up properly. First thing you do, you need to come down and get a layer comp window. Go here to layer comps, click that. All right, you'll have this menu system over here. You want to go over to the right, down to this file, go all the way down to keyboard shortcuts. Now, we're in this menu. You want to go to panel menus. You go down to layer comps, open that up. So what we're doing here is we're setting up our hotkeys. I like the brackets because it's a forward and back bracket, so accept that. So the whole point of this is that you want to be able to cycle through all of your layers. As you see, I brought in all those files, but I want to be able to flip through those files sequentially. Anything that has the eyeball on your layers will be visible in the layer comp that you suggest. You refresh it each time by using that cycle button at the bottom. I brought those files in, but you can also draw as you go, and then you create layers, and you just keep everything ordered. You keep everything in their folders with your menu system. Try to be as organized as you can, and then it'll make your whole life easier. But you can see how this is becomes really cool because you can actually cycle through. You don't have to keep turning on and off those eyeballs as you're working. And you see how when this shot where the character on the right is falling into the water, how it goes from one frame to the next frame to the next frame. You can pretty much almost animate, really, in this thing with this layer comp setup. And there you go. What you're about to see. You'll see 3 sections: the cliff fight, the aftermath of the fall, and then a revised pass I did afterwards. I love starting with this profile shot. It felt iconic, a strong, clear way to open the sequence. This next section is a one-point perspective shot following the character inward. It's simple, but it creates a really strong sense of focus and momentum. So I want to walk through this like this. What you're about to see is the animatic version of the cliff fight. When I originally worked on this project, I was hired strictly as a storyboard artist. Everything you're seeing here was boarded with animation in mind, meaning it was already structured to drop directly into an animatic. There's a lot of atmosphere up here, and I kept the fangs large and intimidating, letting them take up most of the frame. A big challenge here was staging, figuring out how to place everything so the space feels dangerous without becoming confusing. So why the animatic exists? After the job was over, I took the finished boards and assembled them into an animatic on my own. I wanted to see how everything would move in motion, not just as isolated frames, but in sequence. The main goal here is to take you under the hood, to show you what I was thinking, how decisions were being made, and what was actually going on into the job. So what I'm going to do here is let the animatic play and comment over it as we go. Shape, gesture, and energy. I leaned heavily on shape, language, and gesture throughout this fight. I threw out a lot of shapes early, just to see how they would collide and intertwine. Even when the characters are surrounded, I wanted to keep the action readable and contained. Another note about lensing and composition. A lot of this was treated almost like a long lens. Long lenses flatten perspective and compress space, which creates tension and strong compositional moments. During the actual fighting, I relied heavily on shape language and gesture to drive the motion. That was the backbone to making the sequence feel alive. So that's the approach behind this sequence, how the board's motion and design thinking all came together. So there's a character power contrast I was trying to communicate. The Fang leader is much larger than Mizu, and I really wanted to lean into that contrast. I imagined him as this hulking presence, heavy, grounded, imposing. Even when he's not moving much, his weight should be felt. When he presses his sword down onto her, it's not about choreography, it's about weight dominance and resistance. This section had to be built very quickly. Because of that, most of this is driven through loose gesture. If you pause the animatic, you'll notice how rough and open a lot of the drawings are. That's intentional. The goal was to do just enough so you could track who's who and what's happening. There's also a section where she just takes damage. That pause matters. It gives the sequence breadth and contrast. Even though animation storyboards are often close to one-to-one with animation, things still change as more hands touch the project. My original version was graphic. The Fang leader is disemboweled and washed away by the ocean. As the project evolved, the beats shifted. That's just the reality of working in a pipeline. So what you're seeing here isn't just finished work. It's a record of decisions, revisions, and constraints, all layered together. This is what storyboarding actually looks like in practice. This last section is a revised pass I did well after the job was finished. At the time, Blue Eye Samurai was boarded entirely in Photoshop. Later on, when I started learning Storyboard Pro, I revisited the sequence. I had sketches and thumbnails that never made it to the final delivery, and this was a chance to explore those ideas. Just like we talked about in episode 1, ideas evolve through revision. Even this pass is still very gestural and rough, but it allowed me to articulate a few things more clearly. One of the main ideas was the fall itself. I wanted it to feel dangerous, uncontrolled, like she had no agency in that moment. When she hits the ground, she's surrounded by the aftermath of the fight. She wasn't in control, and she still has to fight again. That's something the revisions give you, the chance to find the magic later, even after production has moved on. You never know what those ideas will become. Thank you for spending your time with me. If this breakdown was useful, like and subscribe. It helps the work find the people it's meant for.